Just modeling that vulnerability. When parents are able to do that for their children, oftentimes kids will think there's two emotions, good and bad, two feelings.
Right.
But helping them to put language to express what they're feeling so they aren't weighed down so heavily by what they're feeling, which goes back to that ongoing conversation that we're having with our kids. Letting them know, too, that they are loved and that they are supported with real life, one-on-one relationships that are mutually nurturing and mutually respectful, rather than just having friends on their cell phones, right?
Everything has to be so black and white when you're 16, 17, 18, and then I think as you get older, you realize that there's a lot of gray in between there. You guys are phenomenal. You're on the front line of this, and so I'm such a fan of 12 Talks. I'll mention it again. Go to the website. It's 12talks.com. Great information for parents. I want to thank Pamela Gould, Heather Trish, the one of the few professionals I know with two first names, as a first name and a last name, Heather Trish and Michelle Gonzalez. You are so helpful, and let's hope that maybe by this time next year we can reverse some of the numbers in Jefferson County. I so appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone, and thanks to all of you for joining the conversation. Let's talk again soon.
In local elections, our vote is our voice, so it's our responsibility to use it.
Get ready, Denver. It's almost time to vote for our mayor, city council, clerk and recorder, auditor, and more on Election Day, April 4th. Ballots go out March 13th, and you have until March 27th to return it by mail or drop it off when it's convenient for you at any one of the citywide ballot drop boxes or drive-thrus. If you choose to vote in person, vote centers will be open through 7 p.m. on Election Day. To help research your vote, watch upcoming Denver Decides forums and visit denvervotes.org. Drop off your ballot or be in line to vote by 7 p.m. on Tuesday, April 4th. And be ready when it's time to vote.
Prepárate, Denver, ya casi es hora de votar. Para nuestro alcalde, consejo municipal, secretario y registrador, auditor y más. El día de las elecciones, 4 de abril. Las boletas salen el 13 de marzo y tienes hasta el 27 de marzo para devolverlas por correo. O déjelo cuando sea conveniente para usted en cualquiera de los buzones de entrega de boletas o en los autoservicios de toda la ciudad. Si elige votar en persona, los centros de votación estarán abiertos hasta las 7 p.m. el día de las elecciones. Para ayudar a investigar su voto, vea los próximos foros de Denver Decides y visite denvervotes.org. Por lo tanto, entregue su boleta o haga fila para votar antes de las 7 p.m. el martes 4 de abril y esté listo cuando sea hora de votar.
Welcome to the Safety, Housing, Education, and Homelessness Committee of Denver City Council. The Safety, Housing, Education, and Homelessness Committee begins now.
Good morning. I am Councilwoman Robin Kinich. I am your chair of the Safety, Housing, Education, and Homelessness Committee of the Denver City Council. I'd like to welcome you this morning. I'm an at-large member of the City Council, and we always begin with introductions. We have one member with us virtually, so if that member can please introduce themselves.
Good morning, Candy Vaca, District 9.
And here in chambers, please.
Good morning. Excuse me, Kevin Flynn, Southwest Denver's District 2.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Stacy Gilmore, District 11.
Good morning, Paul Cashman, South Denver, District 6.
Good morning, all the way down here by my lonesome, Amanda Sawyer, District 5.
Thank you so much. Well, today we have some presentations, and it's actually the third meeting in a series that this committee has hosted on substance misuse. And if you're tuning in for the first time, today's topic is opioids, but I really want to encourage you to go back and watch our two earlier sessions. There is a misperception, and I've actually read it in several media sources, that opioids, or fentanyl particularly, is the top used drug, the top addiction in the city of Denver, or the most frequently used substance the top substance misuse issue in the state of Colorado. And that is wrong. It is not accurate. The top addiction in the state of Colorado, the top admissions health issue in the Denver health system, we heard from our medical experts in our first panel, is alcohol. It creates the top health issues, the top number of deaths. It costs the most to our health issues. It costs the most in human impacts. Closely followed by, methamphetamines and other stimulants. Opioids are a challenge. Fentanyl is causing overdoses, and we're going to hear about the data, but we learned a lot about the well-rounded set of data and substance misuse issues affecting our community, and that is really important. For those who want to talk about substance misuse, we wanted to ground ourselves in the facts, not in the hype, not in the political rhetoric. We wanted to start at the basics, and that's what we did in this committee. So our first panel was held on February 1st. You can watch the video, you can hear from those talking to us about how the cycle of addiction works in the body, how the environmental, social factors, and yes, genetic predispositions affect human beings, what the medical approach is, and then we learned from those with lived experience in recovery how trauma affects the predispositions and the cycle of recovery, and who supported them. These are not just medical models, right? But what the role of peer support was, and what was helpful, what was not helpful. We heard from folks who had PhDs and medical backgrounds who fell into addiction. We heard from those who graduated with great honors, and we heard from those who experienced homelessness, all of whom experienced addiction and successful recovery. And so we heard from those with that type of lived recovery. We heard from them on March 1st. So each of those are really important stories to hear. This is not just a story about fentanyl. It is not just a story about opioids, but it includes opioids, it includes fentanyl, and we know that we do need to learn about it too. So we're here today with this panel. I encourage anybody who's here today for the first time not to start the story today, but to go back, get those facts, make sure you are talking about this accurately with the complete picture. But once you do that homework, then we start today with Dr. Sterling, who is going to be the first of two presenters. We also have our Denver Department of Public Health and Environment here to include some of the facts that our public health department collects on how this epidemic is affecting our community. And so Dr. Sterling, please introduce yourself. Our second speaker, Dr. Valak, when it's your turn to come up, please tell us about yourself as well. We're here in chambers. This is the only PowerPoints I allowed in the entire series. So we're back here in our chambers to get some visuals for the data. So our prior panels had no PowerPoints. So you are the first to bring us visuals. So thank you so much for the data you bring, and welcome to our City Council today. Thank you.
What a great way to start and a great introduction. It is a larger problem, and opioids are just a piece of the puzzle. I also appreciate that you're going to hear me talk. I know thinking about death and death trends is maybe not the most chipper way to start a day, but for me, honestly, it is. And I think that our data and the deaths can be used for good to help direct policy and help us make decisions to prevent these deaths in the future. So thank you for having me. Just a bit of an introduction. We are going to talk a little bit about opioids in general and how they work. I'll show you some findings from our cases at the medical examiner's office. We're going to show some data that we have of the Denver deaths related to fentanyl, and we'll go over some facts and myth busters at the end. Just as an introduction for myself, I'm Dr. Sterling McLaren. I am a medical examiner at the Denver office of the medical examiner, which means I'm a forensic pathologist. I'm also the chief medical officer for the city and county of Denver, which means I help advise policy on public health. And just to get right into it, types of opioids. So we all know there are prescription opioids like hydrocodone, oxycodone. There's illicit opioids. We know about heroin, we know about fentanyl. But fentanyl is also a prescription opioid. So to not confuse the fact that fentanyl is not just an illicit substance, it's also known to be, or it's well used in the medical field as well. Novel psychoactive substances is another category of opioids. Well, opioids can fall into that category of another type of drug that we're looking at. In our office, we do autopsies on people who die suddenly, unexpectedly, traumatically, and a number of those people die with drugs in their system. So we test for drugs on almost all of our cases. We can find new and emerging trends like novel psychoactive substances if we're looking for them. In a lot of the cases we are. You may have heard of xylazine recently. That's also in our panel. Just a little bit on the background of fentanyl and the way they look, at least in Denver. You can see the two different kinds of blue pills I have in this picture. The one on the top is actually a prescription opioid, that's oxycodone. And it's got an M and a 30 imprinted on it. It's blue and it's a sort of speckled color. We can tell the difference between that and the bottom picture, which is illicitly made fentanyl. Those pills are being produced in clandestine labs, not in a pharmacy. And you can see the surfaces are a little more irregular. Usually the coloring is a little different. And so when we see the pills, we can actually tell the difference when it's illicitly manufactured or not. Originally, these were being sold as oxycodone on the street. You might hear people say they thought they were buying oxy, but it was fentanyl. We really think now that it's pretty commonly well known that this is fentanyl and not oxy. The most important thing would be to get prescription medications from a pharmacy and not from someone who isn't a pharmacist. So just a little bit on how opioids work. There are receptors throughout our body that opioids work on, but particularly important are the ones in the brain. Oh, I guess that animation doesn't work, but you'd see these purple dots floating over and attaching to the receptors. So generally, people are using opioids for pain relief, and that's what they're intended to do. But there are also side effects of opioids. Like I said, we have receptors all throughout our body, actually in the gastrointestinal system as well, so they can lead to constipation and nausea, and that's a common side effect. But that is not a reason someone would want to take an opioid, so that's why it's not the main effect, it's a side effect. Also, dizziness, vomiting, and obviously physical dependence and tolerance, which I saw you guys heard a lot about earlier, and I did watch some of those sessions, and they were wonderful. But of course, the most dangerous side effects we're talking about are the respiratory depression and sedation. So we have receptors in our brain that tell us to breathe, and when they when an opioid attaches, it would slow down how fast you breathe, and it can slow it down all the way to the point where you're not breathing fast enough to maintain life. This is just sort of a simple schematic overview of some of the really important systems in our body. You may recognize the brain, the lungs, and the heart. Opioids, like I said, slow down your brain to make you breathe slower and also decrease your heart rate. And those things are necessary for oxygen to enter the blood and to reach the tissues and keep us alive. So when that stops working properly, then you can lead to a fatal overdose. A side note, There's no regulation on illicit fentanyl, so there is no safe dose because there is no known dose of illicitly made fentanyl. I'm not talking about something you would get in the hospital or from a doctor. I'm talking about the illicitly made substance. So they're not regulated. That pill isn't, 30 milligrams of fentanyl. We don't really know how much is in it because no one's regulating it. And I know you've heard a lot about naloxone as well, so I won't linger here too much, but it is an incredibly safe drug that binds to the opioid receptors. So it kicks off the opioids that are there, it binds to the receptors, and it stops the opioid effect from working. So this is absolutely effective in a fentanyl overdose if administered within the right amount of time before that respiratory depression has gone too far. So again, this is how naloxone works. I sort of explained it, and I don't think the animation works, so I won't linger. Oh, God, there it is. So you can spray the naloxone intranasally. It gets into the bloodstream quickly through the mucosal membranes, attaches to those receptors, and kicks it off. So just a real quick side note, since we are talking, we've said before, it's not just fentanyl that's a problem. We have other drugs out there that people are using. If it's not an opioid, naloxone isn't going to work. If someone is doing something with opioids and other drugs, and those other drugs are fatal, it isn't going to work. It might reverse the effect of the opioid, but it won't reverse the effect of methamphetamine, xylazine, cocaine, ecstasy, ketamine. Those drugs are all considered to be potentially fatal, and naloxone won't work on those. LSD, mushrooms, marijuana, and kratom, we're not exactly considering to be fatal, although kratom is sometimes depending on what it's mixed with, but not mushrooms or marijuana. So again, naloxone won't work in those cases. So for opioid overdoses and generally opioid or overdose deaths in general, we see unfortunately a lot of these every day. We have seen investigators who go out and get the story from the first responders or the family and where the person has died. They bring us information from the scene, and that really helps us determine the manner of death. And I'll get a little bit into that, but not too much. There are 5 manners of death: homicide, suicide, accident, natural, and undetermined. And those are really determined, for us, we make that decision based on what happened and how the person died. So if I get someone with multiple blunt force injuries that came from the top of a parking garage, I don't know if they fell, and that would be an accident, if they jumped, and that would be a suicide, if they were pushed, and that would be a homicide. You understand? So the scene findings really get us the manner of death. Things that we're looking for at the scene include those pressed pills, the burnt foil. So I'll show you in a minute how most commonly we see people in Denver using fentanyl. Needles, lighters, etc. Sometimes the paraphernalia is still in someone's hand because they can die so quickly. Autopsy findings, that leads us to the cause of death. And so that's the actual derangement that happens that leads to the events that end someone's life. So using the drug and the toxic effects of fentanyl would be the cause of death, for an example. And then at the autopsy table, we can see things like track marks. That would be if someone's using needles. Fluid at the external airways. So this is as a result of that respiratory depression, when the lungs aren't working and the heart isn't working properly and they're slowing down, fluid can build up in the lungs and actually kind of come up and out the airway, and we can see that as a foamy, tenacious, really thick fluid. So this is what we see at the scene. This is some of the paraphernalia, the pills you recognize from what I described earlier. The foil, so I don't know if you all know this or not, so I'm going to explain it. You can take a piece of foil and put the pill on top of the foil and light it from underneath like this picture is showing and inhale the smoke from above. It's not common that we see people using fentanyl as a pill, as you would think, like swallowing it. Usually we're seeing it being smoked. And needles have fallen out of favor as well. Just a little nerd slide here in case anybody likes histology like I do. This is a picture of the lungs under the microscope. You can see around the outside of the circle is this beautiful lung tissue. It's very lacy and open, and in the middle is a big kind of ball of stuff. This is polarizable crystals we can see, and depending on where we see them, it may indicate that someone was inhaling or someone was injecting, and depending on what part of the lung we see them in. So the data. This is a national data, Colorado data that is showing overdose-related deaths since 2017 through 2021. I will give you this disclaimer now. It's death data takes a while to compile and get it right, so our 2022 data in a larger sense isn't complete it usually is about a 4 to 5 month lag for data to actually be complete for death data. So some of these will have 2022 numbers. I believe what I have in here is maybe only missing 1 or 2 cases possibly, but quite complete for 2022 for our office. This comes from Colorado, so it's a little bit delayed for when you're looking at the state level of reporting and things. So what you can see here, the top line is any opioid involved in a death, which you can see that steady increase since 2019. We've got heroin and cocaine at the bottom in the blue and purple, and then in the middle here that are showing quite another significant increase, we have methamphetamine and fentanyl. I'll talk more about methamphetamine as well, but these two really go hand in hand. We see them commonly together. Back before 2019, you can see that methamphetamine was really the problem and fentanyl wasn't showing up as much. And then around 2020, we see that switch where fentanyl sort of took over. And this is a map of the state of Colorado, so showing kind of a heat map for Denver. And I'm just trying to show on this slide with the numbers that yes, we do see the most cases in Denver, but it's also controlled for population size. So in compared to the state, Denver is seeing a higher rate of fentanyl-related deaths. So this is a graph from our office. So our jurisdiction is the city and county of Denver. Anyone who uses a substance or is injured, is how we call it, in the city and county of Denver, becomes our jurisdiction. So that's who this is who we're representing with this graph. So the top red portion is the fentanyl-related deaths. Fentanyl is on the death certificate. It may be just fentanyl, or it may be fentanyl with other drugs, and I have some more data later to show that. So 233 cases in 2022, which again, we've got probably just a few lingering out there maybe to add to that number. So it's actually gone down since last year, which was at 239. I like this slide the best. I know there's a lot on here, but I want to explain what's going on. So the blue line is fentanyl. Again, you can see that big increase. The purple line is heroin, and we've seen our heroin-related deaths go down significantly. It has fallen out of favor. It's not used as much anymore, and it's not because heroin's getting safer. It's because people are using less. The methamphetamine is the yellow line in the middle, and like I said, fentanyl and methamphetamine are going quite hand in hand. They're almost 50-50 in terms of prevalence on death certificates. You can see well, maybe you can't see, but in the chart below, we've got the total number of drug deaths, and I think in 2019, it was 225 people we had signed the death certificate as an overdose, and you can see by this year in 2022, we've got over double that, so it has continued to be an increasing problem. Fentanyl, again, has tripled, and methamphetamine has increased as well. Cocaine's not on the bar graph, but it's just listed there in the numbers in case you were interested. And then this is what I keep alluding to. This is how many substances are on the death certificate. We sign out the cause of death as the combined toxic effects of fentanyl, methamphetamine, and whatever else is on board that we think might be contributing to the death. And with these, looking through the lens of when fentanyl is on the death certificate, how often is it just fentanyl? That's about 17% of the time. So really, most often, it is fentanyl along with other drugs, 2 or 3 substances right in the middle there. That accounts for the majority of our cases. The latter 4 and 5 drugs on board are a little bit less common. And so what are those substances? Methamphetamine, by and large, is accompanying fentanyl. This is a little bit difficult to understand if you look at the numbers and you're trying to think mathematically, because somebody may have a death certificate that says the combined toxic effects of fentanyl, methamphetamine, and ethanol, that's the top three, they're going to be counted twice. They're not mutually exclusive in this graph, but it's just sort of a nice visual to show methamphetamine, ethanol, and cocaine are accompanying fentanyl in the causes of death, and we see benzodiazepines, gabapentin, and other opioids as a little bit less common. And then the call-out box here, again, is just showing that almost half, so 42% of deaths that had fentanyl on board also had methamphetamine. This is looking at what I had talked about with manner. So the circle graph there, most of the deaths that we see that we attribute fentanyl to are considered accidental in manner. It's suicide is a small portion, and then undetermined, where we can't decide what the manner is because we don't have enough information. It is not a common drug for someone to use in order to commit suicide. And then we've got where the deaths are occurring. So by and large, people are dying in a residence, either their own or someone else's residence. And then the smaller parts of the graph are hospital, which that's usually people that are getting transported to the hospital and then dying there. That's not where you were using the drug, although sometimes it is. And then outside or hotels and other commercial establishments and parks and stuff like that are small portions of those. Most people are using and dying at home. And then this is a demographics chart just to show you the age breakdown of who we are seeing that are dying from fentanyl overdose. It is mostly between the ages of 25 and 44, although we do see people under the age of 18 who are using and dying of fentanyl as well. That number did not exist in our office before 2019. There were no cases under the age of 18 that I could find. So this is a new problem to pay attention to. And just to give you a peek at our 2023 numbers for the month of January, that's in the pink bar, the farthest to the right, so outpacing last year's January and all previous Januaries in terms of how many deaths we were attributing to fentanyl. And then just to leave you with this, about every 38 hours last year, someone died from a fentanyl overdose. So thank you for your time, and the next speaker is coming up now.
Thank you, and I truncated your name. I'm so sorry. Dr. Sterling McLaren. My bad. I apologize.
That's fine.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. McLaren, and thank you, council members, for having us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Rob Valek. I am a born and raised Denverite, so went to Manual High School, Go Bolts, 1982. Just so you know, I'm one of Denver's own, and have been my entire life, so I'm very proud of that. So happy to be here, despite the difficult circumstances. My day job is I run a drug abuse prevention center at the University of Colorado on the Anschutz campus, the Center for Prescription Drug Abuse Prevention, and we focus on trying to coordinate our statewide response to the opioid crisis, and have been for about the last decade. We were created by then Governor Hickenlooper to coordinate the state response. We do a lot of interagency cooperation kind of work, education, policy work, stakeholder engagement, all kinds of things, sort of trying to be a glue kind of organization around the state. A lot of what we do is then try to educate about opioids in general. And as you heard from Dr. McLaren, who is fantastic, right on the front lines, people that you listen to, the Sentinel event, canary in the coal mine kind of thing, is listen to her. That's who I call, is people like her, to say what is really happening, because she has the evidence of what's really happening and can see it first. So that's always important to do that. But when the more you learn about it, and then you hear about things in the media, and you hear about things from police, and you hear about things from constituents, and you hear about all kinds of stuff going on. And rightly so, there was a lot of concern about fentanyl, and people are scared about it. And at the one level, we should definitely be scared about it. It's a very lethal compound. The most lethal opioid that has been introduced is fentanyl. Anything more than that, these new nitazines and novel psychoactive compounds really aren't opioids in that sense. They're created for other psychoactive purposes, but also work on the opioid receptor. So it's a bit of a nuance, but really in terms of just opioids and how things have evolved, fentanyl is the most potent thing we've ever seen. And I always tell people it's the same game we've been playing for thousands of years. If you heard of the Opium Wars in Imperial China, and you heard about morphine, and when that was created in 1849, you heard about the soldier's disease after the Civil War. You hear about heroin being created in 1898 by Bayer Pharmaceuticals, by the way. It was a pharmaceutical company that created heroin. And same chemist invented heroin and aspirin in the same year, 1898. I always say got one right, got one, well, I'm not so sure about the other one. I'm happy about the aspirin, not so happy about the heroin. But it's been evolving like this, and the only change has been each subsequent iteration is more potent, and the compound is more lethal. Heroin is more potent than oxy, which is more potent than morphine, which is more potent than opium tincture. And the potency just goes up. The drug does the same thing, works in the same places in the body, it just does it much more efficiently, and tinier and tinier and tinier amounts are lethal. And now we're at the point where that's so easy. Heroin was still relatively difficult to cultivate, produce, distribute. There's a lot to do with heroin. Fentanyl, not so much. You can get precursors to fentanyl, it's entirely synthetic. You can get chemical precursors from Pakistan, China, and other parts of the world, shipped to you, convert the last step into fentanyl and ship it into the US rather easily. And small quantities in thousands of envelopes. It's easy to do this and avoid detections. You don't need semi-trucks, you don't need runners, you don't need all of this stuff. It can be done by the USPS, DHL, FedEx, and UPS are the world's leading distributors of fentanyl in terms of distribution channel. So we have a new problem, is being aware of this and making people aware of it is all the more paramount. Always has been a problem, always has been something to make people aware of, but now making our kids, our colleagues, everybody aware of this thing being here, and that's what we spend a lot of time doing. Public awareness campaigns now about harm reduction among those age groups that Dr. McLaren talked about, the 19 to 45 especially. We have a campaign called Keep the Party Safe. If people are going to do even something simple, they don't think they're seeking fentanyl, but I am gonna get one OxyContin tablet, or someone's gonna share a couple. Someone got 5 or 6 of them to share this weekend with us. That's a deadly proposition now. That used to be not a good idea. Now it's a deadly idea, because you don't know what's coming. And so that's a real big problem. And we need to be aware of it and teach people about it. But in the education, there's a lot of information and a lot of misinformation that goes in there. And I hear about it all the time. And people, they usually email me right away. You know, I was texting a minute ago, waiting for my turn, and it's a reporter going, what about this? What about that? Is this true? Is this not true? And there's a lot of misinformation. So I like to talk about the misinformation as well. Things that you hear about fentanyl that isn't necessarily true, because some of these things prevent us from taking action and doing things particularly well. The first one, the first myth that you hear, and I used to use Mythbusters and the whole thing, but the Discovery Channel people get mad when I try to take the logos and put them in presentations, and they get angry with me when I steal Mythbusters. And I thought it was a great idea. But actually, we'll just call it facts and myths. But the first myth is that you can overdose on fentanyl just by touching it. If there was fentanyl powder here and you touched it, you can overdose. Not true. That can't happen. It doesn't absorb easily through the skin at all. The pharmaceutical industry created Janssen Pharmaceuticals, a chemist invented fentanyl, isolated it in 1960. It took over 25 years for the pharmaceutical industry to figure out how to put it in patch form and the right gels and get it onto the skin and have it absorb gradually through the skin to force it through the skin. It took 30 years of technological innovation, and you would have to put 16 patches on your body and wait for 2 to 4 hours for it to reach a concentration that would be enough, that would be more than a medical dose. And so you really almost can't force it into your body. The only way you can do it is snort it, smoke it, or inject it to get it into your bloodstream enough, in a concentration enough to end up doing the things that she just presented about. So you can't. So people think, I can't go into this room, I can't approach a person who may have overdosed from this, because if I touch it, or it's in the air, I will breathe it, or I'll touch it and I will overdose. Not true. So it's important, because we hear a lot about that problem, that cops are unwilling, people who drive buses are unwilling, people won't go into a scene where someone might be, because of the perceived overdose risk. There may be other risks, I'm not saying there aren't risks, but it's not of you overdosing on fentanyl. And the last thing I'll mention is a colleague of mine published a case report on this, a pharmacist in Wisconsin, and it's published, had gone out in bike riding on the weekend, fell, scraped their hand and all this stuff, was mixing fentanyl in some bags for surgery in the pharmacy, the hospital pharmacy in Wisconsin, spilled a vial of concentrated fentanyl liquid on their open wounds, and no problem, rinsed it off, went back to work. You don't overdose from fentanyl just by touching it. So people shouldn't be afraid of that. Second is people will say naloxone, this Narcan we're talking about, doesn't work on fentanyl. We gave 2 doses and the person didn't wake up. So the naloxone doesn't work. And ordinarily, what has happened is it wasn't an opioid overdose. Or people didn't wait long enough and give a second dose. Sometimes a second dose might be required. Most of the Narcan stuff that you see now, the manufacturers that make it, these come in 2-dose packages with 2 of them. So if someone doesn't respond in a minute or 2, squirt the other one in the other nostril, 99.9% of the time, that's enough for everybody if they've got an opioid overdose, including fentanyl. It's just not gonna work if it's nitazines, if it's meth, if it's anything else. It's not designed to work on those compounds, so it doesn't work for those compounds. So most often, it's just not an opioid overdose they're having if naloxone doesn't work. In fact, EMS will tell you this. They come on scene. Anybody who's unconscious, they'll administer naloxone to them, just as a matter of protocol. And if they respond to it, you can tell it's an opioid overdose. If they don't, it might be, but it's usually something cardiac. So they use it as a diagnostic tool because it's so efficient in working all the time if it's opioids, not if it isn't. It's not only therapeutic, but it's diagnostic. So naloxone does work on fentanyl, so people shouldn't be worried that it doesn't work. Third is, as was already mentioned, fentanyl does have approved uses. Fentanyl is a good drug, used by the right people in the right circumstances. My father was an anesthesiologist and pain management doc. Fentanyl is a perfect drug for someone who's an anesthesiologist. You're going into surgery and you're about to have yourself cut wide open. And I was about to have my appendix removed. And the anesthesiologist came in and said, we're going to give you these 2 anesthetics and we're going to give you a little teeny weeny bit of fentanyl. I said, great, bring it. I do not want to be sliced without a little bit of pain relief, and I'll take some of that because it's a perfect drug for surgery. It works very fast, clears very fast. Good drug. It's when it gets diverted and non-medically used that it becomes the problem, because it is highly addictive, very potent, and teeny microgram doses used by an anesthesiologist. Great drug. Anything other than that, bad idea. So it's a matter of the wonders and problems of technological innovation, right? Which we see this with all kinds of technologies that are wonderful in some ways, and they're also, if they're used for bad purposes, they can be very, very difficult to figure out how to control. But fentanyl does have legitimate uses. Next is people say you have to have a hazmat suit to go into a room where fentanyl was. Not true. If you heard the earlier part, you can't breathe it, you can't touch it, whatever. It's difficult to get in, force it into your body. You could take the powder and try to force it into your body, and you couldn't. So you really don't need elaborate PPE. People just say, it's basic surgical masks so you don't inhale a whole bunch of it by mistake, which would be hard to do, but something simple like that would prevent it as a barrier, and nitrile gloves even, at the most. I wouldn't even so much worry about the gloves. But if people think you have to have a hazmat suit, and cops will tell you, I'm not going in there. There's fentanyl possibly in there, I'm not going in there. And that's problematic, not only because the worry doesn't need to be had on their part, but also someone may not be rendered aid because of that fear. And we're not going to go up, we're not going to touch this person, we're not going to enter this room. That's another opportunity to lose a life when we could have easily saved it. Rush in, give naloxone. That should be what we're thinking, because I'm absolutely as fast as I can get in there and get the naloxone on board and find out if this is an opioid overdose. And if not, tell the EMS that you gave it, and they'll take it from there and can differentiate. One of the last ones is people say they feel sick, and this is, to me, one of the most concerning ones, is people confuse other symptoms for opioid overdose and declare that they had one. You see a lot of these reports now, typically from cops, and I'm not singling out cops, but this happens with others, but it'll be a cop says they pulled somebody over, they interacted with a person, they went back to the car, and they overdosed on fentanyl from the scene. And they had a fentanyl overdose. And it's even reported, this was reported on the CBS News about a month ago, national news. I'm watching the national news with my jaw hanging open going, oh my God, where was the doctor that verified the overdose? Did they go to the emergency room and get blood drawn? No. None of these that are reported have the appropriate diagnosis then by a doc in the emergency room and says, yeah, that was a fentanyl overdose. And that's what I want. And because the last time I checked, no disrespect to cops, friends of mine are police officers. One lives 3 doors down from my house, a good friend of mine, aren't qualified to say that was a fentanyl overdose. They should go to the hospital and determine if it was. And maybe it was, but I would defy you to find one. I haven't found one yet where anybody has toxicologic information behind it to back it up that it really was. Most often what people are experiencing are symptoms of panic attack, which is understandable. They're afraid about fentanyl, but they did not overdose on fentanyl. And their symptoms are not consistent with an overdose. Their breathing didn't slow, and they didn't pass out, and they didn't go that direction. Their pulse was racing and was thready, and they're a million miles an hour, and they're feeling really anxious. Panic attack, anxiety attack. Understandable. I'm not saying you shouldn't have one, or why would you have one? I understand it, but it is not an opioid overdose, nor is feeling sick. It's really just slows you down. Pain will go away if you had any. There's no like, oh, nausea, vomiting. I mean, it could be a little if you're taking opioids chronically. Fentanyl won't do this. So the presentation is all wrong for this to be an overdose. It's really a fear of fentanyl, not overdose from fentanyl. So people report those all the time, and I keep waiting for the tox reports from these supposed overdoses from secondary exposure. And if there are some, I want to see them. I will stand corrected and I will admit my mistake. But until then, I'm waiting. And the last one is fentanyl is everywhere. It's in cannabis, it's in this, it's in that. Fentanyl is everywhere. And while it is more increasingly present, the most common is what you see is in the pressed tablets or in what is counterfeit versions of cocaine or meth. Those are the 3 biggest ones that we're seeing as far as intercepting drugs and what has it in there. It's not been seen, at least I haven't seen any, where it's been laced in cannabis product, where people talk about vaping it, that it can be vaped or put in with vape cartridges or cannabis that's vaped. And the boiling point of it, in order to get this into a point where you could vape it, is almost 900 degrees. And most vape pens only heat to maybe 300, maybe 400, 450, the most powerful ones, or maybe half strong enough to get that thing to volatility and make it inhalable that way. So people will just burn it and heat that thing to hundreds of degrees, and that's how people would get it in, is with foil and heat. But vaping technologies aren't sufficient to get that hot enough to vaporize that thing. So it's really, we haven't seen it in cannabis. Maybe, Dr. McLaren may have other data that she may have seen it somewhere, but the data sources I have seen from poison control and from seizures, from cops and ATF and all of that, haven't reported it in cannabis. So that's the main sources. And why is this all important? Is some of these misconceptions can perpetuate the myths, because if you tell your friends what you heard, and this is what happens, you can overdose when you touched it, and they said that, and that spreads like wildfire. Like that information dissemination is 15 times faster than proper, accurate information. We know misinformation spreads faster. That's a problem. And so we need to address that. So hence, when they ask, when Ann says, hey, would you come down? Absolutely. Hopefully, just a few people at a time, because you're respected in your communities. People talk to you, and you talk to your constituents, and you should have the right information to have the ability to cut off some of the misinformation. And because it does cause people to delay or refuse to render aid, further stigmatizes people who use or inject, and further stigmatizes them, which is already the number one obstacle and enemy that we face in this whole crisis is stigma. The people with use disorders, people who inject, are bad people, don't deserve to be cared for, are somehow different, which isn't true, because that's somebody's son, daughter, brother, sister, mother, mother, father, friend. That's just not true. Everybody was somebody's kid. And, so it's just further stigmatizes people. And with that stigma and this fear that these myths can perpetuate, people will be driven further underground, not seek treatment. People don't want to talk to me. And it can really create more of the stigma that we're trying to fight and have been for decades, trying to fight this stigma. And it even draws people in who use it legally. Again, fentanyl patches for people with cancer or chronic pain complex regional pain syndrome, some people find that effective and their doctors prescribe it. Now they are fentanyl using, and that's all automatically bad, which isn't true. FDA approved since 1964, and it's been my whole lifetime it's been available. And again, good drug if prescribed and used properly. So that's why I'm here to share that kind of stuff, and then I'll pass it off now to have others tell you about some of the resources that are available in the community. Thanks.
Great. Many thanks to Dr. McLaren and Dr. Ballack for talking through a lot of the facts, a lot of the myths. You've heard a lot about substance use disorder and how some of this can be effective. We would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about what we're doing to address this problem. So I'm Tristan Sanders, and the Director for Community and Behavioral Health at DDPHE. We have a number of programs in our substance misuse section that are working towards how best to comprehensively address substance use issues in the city. I should also call out our friends here from Caring for Denver who fund a lot of this work. If you want to know specifically, we could provide that information, but it would be too much for me to talk through. So first, we as an office provide naloxone and fentanyl test strips free to any resident of Denver through our website. So you can go on our website, you can go to our substance misuse section, you can put in your address and your name, and we will mail you a two-dose of naloxone kit along with fentanyl test strips for testing your drugs. There's a little pamphlet about how to use all of those materials, and we offer an email address back to our office to provide any training or answer any questions for folks that might be receiving that. I believe to date, we have sent out over 6,000 what we're calling overdose prevention kits. Pretty robust program. It certainly has ebbed and flowed in the demand for those materials, but we've consistently seen interest in receiving these much needed tools for addressing overdoses. Second, we have a number of outreach teams, which really the goal of these teams is early identification of both mental and behavioral health issues as well as substance use disorders. If we're able to connect with people prior to getting to a point where you might be overdosing and get them connected to services, that's going to be the best path forward. And so we've got our Wellness Winnie, which is our mobile behavioral health unit that has both mostly peer specialists, but also folks that are able to do brief assessments and then ideally refer people to appropriate resources that are available in the community. We also have our substance use navigator group team. They go alongside a number of the other outreach teams in the city, some in the Department of Safety, some in Host, some in our office. They are specifically trained in identifying substance use disorders and referring people to the appropriate resources, whether that's for alcohol or for other drugs or for whatever complex cases we might be coming across. We also are currently managing the opioid settlement funds that are coming through the state. So there's lawsuits of all the manufacturers, distributors of opioids. It's resulting in settlements, creating these large pots of money. Begins with the state and then comes down to the local region. We have a council that two of your peers sit on. We've currently developed our plan for how we're going to use those funds, and actually the first RFP being able to put those funds to use in the community is going out by the end of this month. That covers the gamut of treatment, prevention, raising awareness, education, a variety of tools to address the opioid issue in our city is going to be funded through this mechanism. The first RFP we're putting out is going to be for about $4.5 million. That's the bulk of what we received in year one. We stand to receive significantly more as more settlements are happening. These settlements will be coming over the course of 19 years. They're mostly front-loaded, so we receive the bulk of the funds in the first 5 years or so. But we are developing plans every 2 years to identify the best uses of those funds and how to put them out to support both treatment, prevention, education, et cetera, in this area. And lastly, we put this on just about every slide and every pamphlet we offer, but the Colorado Crisis Services line, you can call this number or you can text TALK to 38255. If anybody is facing any issues for whatever reason, this is a great resource to be able to connect with somebody basically immediately and get connected to resources to help deal with whatever may be presenting. So that's just a flavor of what we're doing. I would also mention, because it came up specifically, stigma is one of the biggest barriers we see to getting people into treatment and services. We did complete an anti-stigma campaign with a vendor recently that is putting messages out for target populations, much that many that Dr. Ballack mentioned in that 18 to 35 range, but we're also working with DPS and a number of our youth leadership teams to ensure that we're starting to provide some of that education earlier and earlier as this problem is presenting itself more often in young folks. And I think I'll stop there and we can take questions.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you for acknowledging Lorez Meinhold with Caring for Denver. I did actually just send her a little message asking if there was anything she wanted to share, and so I don't want to put you on the spot. We do have a few questions, but is there anything you would like to comment on before we open it up for questions? Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a few council members in the queue. I have a couple questions as well. We'll start with Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions for the doctors, whoever would like to address them. So naloxone has been around for like 60 years, but the public awareness of it is like through the roof now. I believe that, I'm not a medical person. I don't work in your field. I first heard about it, I believe it was on a 60 Minutes broadcast about 7 years ago, 2018. And who developed naloxone? And I understand it's now available generically, so any pharmaceutical company can produce it. But who first developed it?
Sure, it was first developed. I don't remember which pharmaceutical company developed it, but again, it was 58, 59 years ago. It's been around for a very long time. EMS have known about this forever. It's existed. It's generically available. Both in the vials for the injectable form, which is what it was for many years, was just administered by medical people. But once it started becoming popularized for lay people to use it, it was first take the injectable stuff and put it into a rubber gasket and squirt the injectable version in people's noses, and it still works. Remarkable. But now there's nasal sprays that have been developed. It's just a different formulation and delivery vehicle that a company developed that originally. Licensed that, but now even that is generic. The nasal sprays are now generic, so Teva and other generic houses make them. So there's many manufacturers of the nasal naloxone. Then there's different potencies that are out there, different brand names, different companies are creating stronger versions, so maybe you don't need 2 doses of the one, you do the 1 dose of the stronger. There's that kind of stuff going on in the market, and then there's new products being developed. A pharmaceutical company, the man who was very smart, that did the in-licensing of nasal Narcan for the United States, sold the company, formed a new pharmaceutical company, is researching a new compound called nalmefene that'll be about 100 times more potent than naloxone that does the same things. He's playing the game on the other side. The chemists are getting smarter with fentanyl and nitazines and things that are potent for you to use. We need equally potent antidotes. And that person is working in that field and has drugs in clinical trials now to be a more potent antidote than naloxone for the day that it comes when naloxone is insufficient, because it's only a matter of time.
Would you say that the nasal spray, the Narcan brand name, is the most in use?
It is.
Most effective?
They're all highly effective and safe. Okay. All of them are. Any brand, I would take it. Injectable naloxone, and tear off the vial and pour it in somebody's nose. But any brand of nasal naloxone or injectable is equally highly effective and safe.
As far as a quick, rapid delivery system, though, the nasal.
The nasal, and it's by far the most commonly used by lay people. EMS typically use the injectable because it's more controllable in that setting. But the nasal is 96, 97% of what's used out there is the nasal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I was very intrigued by slide 18, which, if I can get to the right screen here it is, shows that the overdose deaths attributed to heroin have plummeted to, well, it says 10 in the year 2022, compared with a high of 54 in 2017. But the other overdose deaths due to fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine have soared. Do we know why this is the case? Tristan, I don't know do we know why this is happening?
Why heroin's falling out of favor and why fentanyl and methamphetamine are more in favor? I think it's a complex issue. I think it has to do with route of administration, needles falling out of favor, being stigmatized. I think it has to do with supply and cultivation of poppy plants to produce heroin is labor intensive, depends on the environment, very easily spotted by surveillance. Fentanyl is pretty easy to make, and so is methamphetamine. Easy to make, easy to hide, and easy to ship and undetectable. So I think.
Do you know, is anybody analyzing this, studying it? Anybody in law enforcement or in the medical field doing any surveys or analysis as this? Because it seems to me that understanding this trend could be a key to addressing the impacts of it. Is anybody working in that area?
Many people are, and it's well known that it's moving in that direction. It's all economically driven. It's more efficient, it's more potent, it's cheaper to make, cheaper to distribute. It's just pure economics 101. We can get the same effect in a teeny weeny little package and ship more of it and make it easily, and the cost of production is lower, detection is harder. It's an efficiency thing. And it's moving in that direction, and it's not going back. The genie just never goes back in the bottle. We never went back to tincture of opium on the streets. We're not going back there. We're not smoking opium. We're not doing morphine. We're not doing heroin anymore. Heroin's going bye-bye. It won't be long before it's gone. It's going bye-bye. We've been on this ride before. Everybody's like, this is a new thing. I'm like, that's a merry-go-round. If it looks similar, it's because the scenery is the same and the potency of the drug is going up. But the show is the same until the next one comes out that's more potent than fentanyl. Which it will.
Thank you. Last question on slide 21. It shows that more than half of the overdose deaths occur in a residence, but I was intrigued by the second highest, 34 in the last year occurred in a hospital or medical facility, and that strikes me as not a good thing. Why is someone overdosing in a medical facility? So I'm wondering, is this because the person expired in the ER perhaps, but was brought in from another location?
Yes.
Because I hate to think that they're overdosing in a hospital.
This is mostly representative of people who are transported from the scene or wherever they may be, and they're transported to the hospital with CPR in progress. They get to the ED and expire at some point later.
Okay, so in that case, the place of death doesn't really indicate the place of the administration or the injection or the inhalation or the whatever.
Exactly.
Okay. And it's a small number, so it's probably not statistically significant, but it would be nice to know also where those 34 individuals took the drug.
Came from, yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, that's all I have, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Flynn. Next up, Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll first start by thanking you, Madam Chair, for putting this series together. I saw our presenters at the Fentanyl Summit and thought that would be a great topic for everyone to see. But in and of itself, it would have given an incomplete picture of the crisis that addiction really is in our community. So really appreciate the well-rounded series. Dr. McLaren, just going back to a little bit of what Councilman Flynn was talking about, I understand, I guess intellectually, why heroin use would be declining because, you need to raise the poppy crop, so on and so forth. But cocaine is also a crop drug. And I'm wondering why we're not seeing that, or are we seeing a decline in cocaine use?
It's fairly steady. We are not really seeing a decline or increase. This graph shows a slight increase in the state of Colorado, with cocaine being the purple line kind of down at the bottom. But in our office, I don't know if it's on here. Oh, it is. Cocaine's not on the line graph here, but you can see in the numbers, it is increasing along with overdose trends, but not outside of them. So it's fairly steady.
And is that because there's not a purely chemical substitute for it, whereas fentanyl's a replacement for heroin? Is there not a similar, easily manufactured substitute?
Just a quick, I think, cocaine isn't getting more potent, whereas fentanyl is extremely more potent than heroin.
Right.
So this is number of deaths, so we're talking about the end result of something that's really potent. Cocaine really hasn't changed in a long time, but I don't know if there are new, most of the new drugs that we're seeing that are emerging, those novel psychoactive substances, aren't stimulants like cocaine. Most of them are having some kind of opioid effect or a benzodiazepine type effect.
And if you could, and before you answer, sir, help me understand a little bit more what we mean by novel psychoactive substance. What are we talking about?
Yeah, so it's a chemistry project, basically. It's different chemicals that are created to affect someone similar to opioids or benzodiazepines, to have that kind of similar chemical structure and give that effect, but they're being experimented in labs elsewhere.
So it's any new chemical drug that's being created, okay.
Yeah, and generally they fall into categories of opioid-like or benzodiazepine-like.
Sure. Thank you. And sir, did you have something?
I just wanted to add to that question about the stimulants in cocaine and meth. Stimulant stuff has tended to be cyclical over the years. We've seen cocaine kind of wax and wane. Methamphetamine, interestingly, we cracked down really hard on meth labs here in the United States, 15, 20 years ago. Took a bunch of drugs off of over-the-counter status. You can't buy Sudafed in bulk and go around all the drugstores and buy it all up and make your own meth. You can't do that anymore. You almost can't get a hold of Sudafed without a whole lot of trouble. And that was the main substrate for making meth. So most of that died off, and cocaine sort of rose back up. But meth started, we thought we were getting a handle on meth, and all it was a little bit of a delay to give the Sinaloans a little time to ramp up production of meth. And they've taken that back, and so meth is making a widespread comeback, but it's not from little clandestine meth labs in people's basements like it used to be here in the United States. It's mostly imported from Sinaloa, and is the chief supplier of it, is the cartel.
Sure, and the last thing that I wanted to ask is if either of you would like to take issue with the proposition, which I agree with, and which Dr. Thurstone from Denver Health always puts forward, that in this discussion of addiction and the effect of various drugs on the community, that alcohol is king. Is there any disagreement with that?
10 times bigger.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Cashman. Next up is Councilmember Gilmore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question about slide 21 here, and I wondered, so the majority of deaths are accidental. People are at home in their residence and they accidentally overdose, and wanted to understand, is there data, or when you're talking to family, et cetera, to close out a report, how many of those individuals had previously been in treatment? This was perhaps a relapse episode and they had an amount of clean time and then they go right back to using, their tolerance is no longer there and they accidentally overdose. Do you have data on, out of the 126 that passed away in a residence, how many of those were in a relapse sort of episode?
That's a great question, and actually very classic, common presentation of someone that either was incarcerated or in treatment and not accessing drugs and not able to use at a steady rate, and then go back to using at the same amount they were used to, and the tolerance has gone away, and then they die. That's a very classic story. Unfortunately, I don't have data for that, but I can tell you anecdotally, for the reviews that I do on cases, there are a number of these people who have history of treatment and have history of overdoses prior to their death and have history of treatment, so.
Okay.
I don't have the numbers on that particularly. It might be kind of, we do have a statistician, but I think that might be a little bit difficult to tease out because it doesn't end up in the death certificate, so it's hard to trace.
Right, right. And I think because of the stigma that is associated with substance misuse, we don't talk about that enough. And that, we should be letting people know that when they exit our jail, when they, and how, I guess, are we getting that word out and building that network of support around someone to make sure that, they don't overdose during a short relapse, that in different circumstances with support, they might be able to get back on track with, therapy, AA, whatever tools they might want to utilize.
Absolutely, and two points. One of them is the notion of this maybe being a repeat or a relapse. It used to be, and I don't know what the numbers are today. My expectation is it's lowering because of fentanyl's lethality, but it used to be 4.5 was the average number of non-fatal overdoses before a fatal overdose. And a lot of variability, granted, so it wasn't true for everybody. But the average was 4.5. So you normally it would be, wow, this person has taken a while to get here. Fentanyl's changing that game now. Yeah, and I'm sure that number is much smaller, much lower. So it could be the first or second time somebody overdoses because of the lethality of it, because that's why the big jump. We don't believe the number of users, first-time users, people who are doing different things, that's really not changing a lot. It's a pretty stable number of the population. In some areas, it's going down. And if first use is going down, why are the deaths going up? It's the lethality of the compound. It's if we're playing with much stronger fire. So that's an issue. And you bring up the second point is in carceral settings, it's critical because people do have that happen. My cousin had this happen for 4 years and almost 4 years to the day now. Chose to plead guilty to a lesser crime, would not even be convicted. Pled guilty, asked for jail time to get away from the influences in his life and the situation he was in. Did not really get meaningful treatment inside, though he was promised treatment. Treatment was not great. This was not in the city and county of Denver, I can say. Stuff's pretty good here. I know the people that run it, and they're very good. I wish he had been here. But then was released, went back, first use, overdose, death. And now we're talking about funding things in carceral settings. The president talks about Medicaid covering healthcare, including SUD treatment in carceral settings, which has been carved out as a key priority. It's the number one biggest thing we could do in our country right now is to do that. The AG is going to consider things maybe from the Bureau of Prisons has put a proposal forth for some of that settlement funding to do this for prisons in the state, to start everybody who needs it on medication-assisted treatment 3 months before release to stabilize them prior to release, connect them with services post-carceral because it works. It does work. We have models in Larimer County where they do that and they discharge to a network of providers that all sort of take care of people in a network because they know people will pop up over here and pop up over there. So the emergency departments work together, the methadone clinics work together, they share the patient in a network model in Larimer and Weld. And it's fascinating and it works. And those people are like my heroes. I'm like, you are figuring this out, how to take care of people when they transition and keep them alive no matter where they show up in the community. Everybody knows who they are. And it can be done. We can solve these problems. We can put people on the moon. We can do this. We just have to figure out how to do this.
Right on. Thank you. Yeah.
The potency made me think of one thing. Just you had said, do we agree that ethanol or alcohol is king? I just want to make a point that it is not potent like fentanyl is potent. We do not sign out death certificates with acute alcohol intoxication or the toxic effects of alcohol. Rarely we do. By and large, at least when we're talking about death data, it's the chronic effects of alcohol. It's not the acute effects. So the lethality and the potency of fentanyl is really what the problem is. New users and people who are not tolerant being especially at risk. Just wanted to say that.
Right, and I don't want to speak for Dr. Thurstone, but my guess is when he was talking about the overall deaths, it was the chronic long-term effects in terms of co-occurring, heart disease and also alcohol-related automobile deaths in terms of, driving while impaired and accidental deaths and all of the entire range of alcohol-related deaths, not overdosing in the sense of toxicity. So thank you for that. Tristan, did you want to add something? And then I'll jump in the queue with questions.
I'll just add something very quick.
Yeah.
And you heard it, due to the lethality of fentanyl. Our work in outreach and getting people connected to services has become more challenging and has to happen faster and has to happen sooner. And so to Dr. Valek's point, the services that we're able to provide in jail, we have a captive audience for better or for worse, but that's where we can actually start treatment. And then the network of services they get out to once they leave jail is critical to be there immediately. It's not that we can follow up in weeks, right? And so this lethality has really ramped up the need for those outreach services and those services to be connected to folks sooner and before there's lethal overdose. So just to highlight that really important point of how we're doing it.
Back to Councilmember Gilmore.
Gotcha. Appreciate all of that, and want to also draw attention to slide 22 when Dr. McLaren said that we didn't have a 19 to 24-year-old age range prior to 2019, and
under 18
on this side on fentanyl, and so wanted to understand with that, and really the 19 to 44-year-olds. I would assume that they aren't dying of acute alcohol issues either, because they're younger. And so when you're looking at, 19 to 24-year-olds now on the graph for this, I guess, what are you, again, with families, are these youth that are experiencing homelessness? Are these youth that are living at home? I guess, and I know you're at the end of the story most likely, and so that might be some follow-ups that we could maybe get, or if Dr. Valak has additional information, I would just be interested in kind of what the demographic is, or the data on them are. And then my last question is, last night on the national news, they talked about, I think it's xylazine and tranq, and I didn't hear you say anything about that in this presentation, but are we seeing that in Denver yet?
Great questions. I really appreciate that. So to clarify, I'm sorry if I misspoke. The 18 and under category is the new category.
Okay.
Category.
Okay, gotcha.
So that's, school-age children. And I actually did a project a couple of years ago when I was in my fellowship on this exact problem during the COVID pandemic, and what what was happening when we had the COVID pandemic and we had kids out of school, and fentanyl's out of control, and we're seeing all these fentanyl overdoses. So I looked at the data together, and it turns out it was these numbers appeared in 2020 when we had the pandemic and schools were closed and kids didn't have resources and weren't accessing their usual day-to-day, treatment if they had, PTOT, whatever, or not PT, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they weren't getting access to the things they needed. So that's when we saw that number appear. And it has increased, or we've had a couple since then. I can't speak to if they were housed or unhoused. I don't recall any of the cases that I looked at. They were all in a residence. They were all at home. And then the other did I answer that question, I guess?
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and then the other question was about xylazine, and have we been seeing that? So we test for that in our expanded panel, which we commonly do when we see someone with a history of or evidence of illicit drug use. So that's something we will see if it's there. We've had, I think, maybe 2 cases that had xylazine ever. One was in a few months ago, and one was a couple of years or a year or so ago. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more of it, since we're seeing it on the East Coast. Often our drug trends we can see in Ohio and on the East Coast, what's happening there. And then a few years later, we'll see what's happening. It'll come here. So in terms of deaths related to xylazine, again, we've had like maybe 2. I think it's, I've read that it can be mixed in with fentanyl. And I've read that some people may be able to seek it out and purchase it on its own to be used. So I'm not exactly sure how it's primarily being used in the other places where we're seeing it.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks so much. I have a question about the idea of quantity and tolerance. And so I guess that, one of the things that I did was spent some time at the legislature. This council, or the previous council, passed legislation authorizing a supervised overdose prevention site, contingent upon state legislation. And that state legislation is being debated and was working its way through the House. And so I listened to a very long and robust debate involving a lot of facts. And one of the things I really appreciated Councilmember Gilmore's question about tolerance. My wife lost a former DU student who was on her journey to recovery and had what was, and we know, a part of recovery, which was a relapse. And she was alone, and her tolerance had changed, and she used alone, and it proved to be deadly because what she used to use, she could no longer tolerate. One of the things I think I remember having this conversation with Councilman Cashman where I think I missed a beat, where we were talking about fentanyl testing strips, and I was under the impression people were mistakenly getting fentanyl in their drugs still, and missed the point at which that you were only, now you couldn't find heroin and you couldn't find oxy, and you were now knowingly buying fentanyl on the streets, perhaps. And so I guess the question I have, and this is something that, I think many of us don't understand, that at a certain point, when you develop we think that most people who are addicted are using to get high. And one of the things our harm reduction experts teach us is that at a certain point, you are dependent and you may be needing to use the drug to not feel sick. And I'd like you to talk about this for a minute, and the idea of whether or not, with the types of variations in fentanyl and what is available today. So heroin is not available, oxy may not be available, or maybe it is, answer for me. But how can someone today calibrate what they need to get rid of the effects of withdrawal? So if I am chemically dependent, and this is something we talked about in our first panel, I am chemically dependent. I get ill if I don't have this substance, and I need to not feel ill, or I want to not feel ill. And so I am not using to get high. I'm not using to party. I'm using to not be sick. I'm using to not die, because in fact, withdrawal could kill me, my heart. So talk to us about that for a minute. Talk to us about how withdrawal can be dangerous. And then talk to me about that idea of, with these drugs, about what's available on the streets. Can someone calibrate what's safe for them? How can they calibrate that? And then because I want to understand really what's realistic or not realistic with what is available out there now, and how that might be related to the idea of overdose prevention. Can actually someone keep themselves safe? Is that even possible with what's available today?
So I would say, I have a couple of things to say about it. Just the tolerance. The route of administration here is really important. So taking a pill, the effects of that drug will hit you a lot slower and over a steady amount of time. Smoking something is really going to have those effects hit quick and hard, and that's why the high lasts not very long, and that's why you actually can get a high, is by smoking it, because you get it all at once. So the route of administration is an important thing to think about. Smoking is not safe. Also, where the substance is coming from, illicit drugs are not safe. There's no way to titrate or tolerate. That's what I was saying. There's no safe dose of illicit fentanyl because it isn't dosed. It's not regulated. And then I think Dr. Valak had a couple of other things to answer your question. But what we see the most dangerous withdrawal is actually from alcohol. So that is what causes a lot of our alcohol-related deaths, is the withdrawal from alcohol. Versus opioids, it isn't the withdrawal that's killing them, it's the toxic effects of the opioids. So those two substances have different harms. Ethanol is the harm comes from not using when you're used to using. Opioids, the harm comes from using it.
Okay. Maybe you can talk about injection, because I think the idea of an overdose prevention site, the method of administration is injection. So would someone who right now is smoking, they would be injecting instead, right? In theory?
Yeah, most often that's the intent of those sites, but it's variable. It depends on where you are, and those sites operate in other countries. There's a couple of them operating in New York City that are running now to have some experience base on what's happening with those. But anybody who consumes an opioid will become tolerant and eventually dependent physiologically. And then some subset will be addicted and have adverse consequences beyond that. Everybody will face that. If you take an opioid for maybe 3 weeks, even post-surgically, you'll start to be physiologically dependent. and have to sort of slowly taper off, even if somebody has a hip replacement and they take it for 2 or 3 weeks. Will notice, gee, I felt like I had the flu when I was just getting over my hip replacement. That's not the flu, that's junior varsity opioid withdrawal. And you just feel it's very similar, it's just a milder case of it. And once you've got about 3 weeks of that on board, you'll notice it. Anybody, your body changes. Anybody becomes physiologically dependent over time. It's dose and time dependent. Everybody.
It's not about a moral failure.
No, absolutely
I
not.
just heard you say it. This is about
Absolutely
anybody.
Not. It's receptor pharmacology, has nothing to do with moral failure. Nobody says, I want to be dependent, I want to be addicted. Nobody raises their hand when you say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Addicted to heroin. Nobody does. So nobody intends to get there. Nobody has that moral failing that they want to be addicted or whatever. We talk about the high versus, the getting high versus getting well is sort of the lingo. And getting high goes away fairly quickly. That notion that you can really overstimulate your receptors, get this rush of an effect, and get high from that lasts for days to a few weeks. And then your body tolerates it again, and to be able to have that high again would require an even more potent dose, which is potentially lethal. And that phenomenon is called chasing the dragon. And so there's lingo for these pharmacologic phenomena that underneath really is receptor pharmacology in your body. Once you're tolerant and you have a lot of this and you're really physiologically dependent, very difficult to suddenly stop. It almost cannot be done. Sudden precipitous withdrawal from opioids of any kind, once you've been on them long enough and in a high enough dose, is really virtually impossible to stop. A few people I've heard of doing this cold turkey stopping on stuff, which is really horrific to even show. They make movies about it. You watch the movie Trainspotting, you watch there's different movies about how bad this is to try to immediately withdraw from opioids. And people don't necessarily die from the withdrawal. Some people are so miserable, they suicide. More common than not, people suicide from the withdrawal symptoms or the fear of going through it again. I've been through that once. If I'm forced to do it again, I would rather kill myself because that's how miserable it is. And it's absolutely miserable. I've watched it, sat with people who are going through it. I've seen and held the hands of people who are going through it and know what that looks like. And it is miserable. It's very, very difficult to do. So people really are using to get well and stay not in withdrawal. They're in some status of, over time, you become, I'm chasing normal, I'm not high anymore, I just don't want to feel bad. And I'm just trying to get back to normal all day. And that's all I'm trying to do. If I never get high again, I just don't want to be in active withdrawal all the time because that's miserable and I want to die. Because it's that horrible to do that. And other countries are doing different things. How do we handle that? We do it with medication-assisted treatment, medications for opioid use disorder, MOUD. Give people buprenorphine or methadone. It squats on these receptors, does not stimulate you into euphoria. There's no getting high with these. It's stimulating those receptors so you can say, hey, I can relax, not be in withdrawal. I can go to work. I can pay taxes, get my life back. This is a good thing. That's why everybody should have MOUD available immediately on demand. Anywhere you go, it should be the easiest thing in the world to get because it works, it's highly effective, and people don't go into withdrawal and they can start working again and doing all these things. And that's our trouble. And how we handle that is the policy debate. I understand with the legislature, except I listen to the same hearings you listen to all night and listen all night long and stay up and like I need to stay up as it is, but need my sleep. But it's an interesting issue. How do we prevent overdoses? How do we get more people into treatment? How do we harm reduce?
So one real quick question. So, and then I have a question for Tristan. So is the medically assisted treatment, the replacement treatment, which does not provide a high, it just prevents those terrible symptoms you described, as effective for the fentanyl as it was for the predecessors?
It's increasingly difficult to get people stabilized on MOUD for fentanyl. The more potent, we really need methadone for most people, some people can, if the fentanyl has not been on board long enough and at a high enough dose and for a long enough time. It's all dependent on dose, duration, and intensity. But if it's not long enough, buprenorphine can work. Okay. It can work. More often than not, people need access to methadone, which is a more potent replacement product for them. And more often we need methadone. We don't have enough methadone clinics all over the place to treat enough people to be able to do this. And we're going to be chasing this because the numbers of people that are going to need that form of therapy is going to predictably increase faster than we can produce methadone and open methadone clinics. My advocacy at the national level is to make methadone available in primary care like buprenorphine. So I'm going to advocate that for a national solution because that's what we need. Primary care doctors can prescribe methadone for pain today. always have been able to. They can write methadone prescriptions for pain and give you that drug for pain. They cannot write a methadone prescription for opioid use disorder. That's against the law. Makes no sense. The compound is the same. And the argument is the safety of the drug, the divertibility of the drug. The drug is equally divertible and unsafe for use for pain. We're discriminating against patients with use disorder by not making it readily available for having methadone. And until we figure this out as a country, folks are not going to get treatment. They're going to stay on the street, not be able to access it, and they're going to die. So it's very important that we ramp up availability of methadone. Denver has gotten this. You talked to Josh Bloom, a really good friend of mine who lives 6 blocks from my house, runs the methadone clinic at Denver Health. And that's our quest, is to get methadone widely available, to anticipate what is now happening already, and it's going to get worse. And if we don't have methadone widely available, we're going to just see way more of what she'll be up here in front of you until we all figure that out.
Well, maybe I'll just ask you, either my question was going to be, we had a plan for expanding access to this. Is it working? Have we shortened waits? Have we gotten treatment on demand? Is it working?
Denver's one of the better in the state here. We're a leader in the state about doing these things. The methadone clinic with the jail, the first.
Yeah.
Was the first in the state. Denver is leading in many, many ways on this, which I'm very proud of as a citizen of this city, born and raised, to be able to do this, that we are. But everywhere still has a long way to go. You know, to get methadone access easily, you can drive by Denver Recovery Group on my way down here. I did. Drove by to wave hi to Denise and say hello as I'm driving by there. But methadone clinics need to be more available than the 3 or 4 places you can go in a city of our size. We don't just have 3 or 4 doctors' offices to serve the general population for the general things like diabetes and asthma. And 3 or 4 clinics is not enough to serve a city of our size, despite the fact it's good.
Yeah. Tristan, did you want to chime in?
So you're right, we do have a plan to expand all this. I mean, it is one of the primary available uses of the opioid settlement dollars that we're putting out for bid. At the end of this month, we hope to see many of those treatment providers applying to us to expand the places that they offer those treatments. We also hope to expand the number of outreach teams that are able to access and refer people to those treatment places. So it's sort of both and. We need more treatment places, more people providing it. We also need a better system of getting people to those treatment options. And so we're really looking at both of those through both the opioid settlement dollars, also through the ARPA funding that we received in our office. We'll be putting up opportunities for funding in that area as well. And I know Denver obviously funds a lot of work in this area as well.
Okay.
So it's coming.
Thank you. I don't see any other colleagues in the queue. Oh, Councilmember Gilmore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Valek, I think you stated it very clearly, but we are all listening to different candidates running for mayor. And we do have some folks that are advocating, one for forced rehab for individuals, forced rehab or jail, and then also talking about having people detox within our jails. And wanted you to reiterate again, when people are going through unassisted detox in not good situations, the outcome is not always good. And what I heard you say was that people will end up committing suicide to not have to go back through that pain. And just any final words on that sort of philosophy, I think, in working with people who are severely, severely ill.
The key to what you mentioned is this is a medical diagnosis and it's a disorder. And as such, there are ways to do medically assisted, to do medical withdrawal management. What formerly was called sort of detox, now it's called medical withdrawal management. But to handle this medically, and other versions of detox, which really are not, which is lock somebody in a room and let them deal with it, is not medical withdrawal management. It's, in my view, barbaric and has no place anywhere when we have effective ways to work with people medically, establish the diagnosis, which is diagnosable. If somebody is going through opioid withdrawal, is a diagnosis, and use disorder is a diagnosis, and medical care should be provided for anybody with a medical diagnosis coming in, is my view. Again, I'm editorializing, but this is my view, and I believe the evidence supports it very clearly that this is effective. and that people who do not have access to that have higher rates of suicide from just even the fear of going through that. So it really, in my view, there is no question we should be treating this as what it is. And the ADAA recognizes this as substance use disorder and withdrawal as protected conditions under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We should be viewing it this way. It's a medical condition. How would we treat somebody who is having an epileptic seizure? How would we treat somebody with a diabetic coma, that they're coming in with a diabetic-induced coma? How would we treat them if they're having a heart attack? All the same to me. Medical condition. Treat it. We have the ability. We have doctors. We need to treat it that way.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much to Denver Department of Public Health and Environment, to Dr. Sterling McLaren, and to Dr. Valek for being here today, to those of you doing this work, and to my colleagues for all their great questions. We are adjourned.